Montana Territory, autumn 1883. Some buildings stay cold because no one bothers to light the fire.
He had something to say. He hadn't found the words yet. He had carried that key for 6 weeks. It had never felt this heavy.
She had built all of this in 6 weeks, alone. And he had not once asked her name.
Some things take 6 weeks to build. Some take longer to say.
The sky above Sulphur Creek Valley turned the color of old iron and bruised violet in the hour before dark, and Corbett Aldane had been standing outside the smokehouse long enough to know he was no longer there to check on anything practical. He had the key in his hand, a small iron thing on a strip of worn leather, the bow of it smooth from years of sitting in a desk drawer untouched and smoother still from the past 6 weeks in his coat pocket, where it had somehow ended up and never found its way back. He turned it over in his palm the way a man turns a stone he found on a riverbank, not examining it, just holding it because putting it down would require deciding something he wasn't ready to decide. Inside the smokehouse there was light. Not much, just the amber thread of firelight bleeding through the gap at the bottom of the door. There was sound, too, if you stood close enough and the wind dropped for a moment. The low respiration of a fire being tended exactly right. The specific silence of work being done by someone who had no doubts about the work. He had been standing here for 20 minutes. He knew because he'd watched the last of the sun go behind the Anaconda Range to the west, and the cold had come in afterward the way it always did in October in this valley, not gradually but all at once, like a door flung open in a room you'd been keeping warm. He was not a man who felt cold easily. He felt it now. The trouble was that he had something to say. He had been building toward it since midday, turning the words over the same way he turned the key, checking the weight, testing the edges, looking for the place where they fit together into something a man could actually speak out loud without the whole construction falling apart in his mouth. He hadn't found that place yet. He was beginning to suspect it might not exist in the particular vocabulary of a man who had spent the better part of 35 years learning that silence was a form of competence. 6 weeks ago, this building had been a source of shame he walked past quickly and stopped looking at directly. Now he was standing outside it in the dark because there was a woman inside. These two facts were related in a way he was only beginning to understand the dimensions of. He took a breath of air that tasted of hickory and salt and something older than either the smell of provisions laid in properly of a winter that had been genuinely prepared for, which is a different smell entirely from a winter that has not been. Then he put his free hand on the doorframe, not knocking, just resting there. And the story came back to him the way stories do when you're standing still long enough to let them. It had been a Wednesday in early October when Mabel Forsythe came to Copperline. Not on the passenger coach. The passenger coach ran on Tuesdays and cost more than she had. She came on the lumber wagon of a trader named Biggs, who was hauling planks down from the mill country north of Billings and didn't mind a quiet passenger who didn't ask questions and shared her cornbread at the midday stop without being asked. Biggs set her down at the edge of Copperline without ceremony, the way a man sets down cargo he has been entrusted with and has delivered intact. She thanked him. He tipped his hat and turned his horses north. She stood on the single main street of Copperline, Montana Territory, and looked at it the way a person looks at a place when they are deciding whether it can give them what they need, not whether they like it. There was not much to inventory. 3 blocks of storefronts, wood-framed and practical. A church at the eastern end with a bell that needed rehanging. A telegraph office with a lamp already lit in the window against the coming dark. Mountains to the north so enormous they functioned less like scenery and more like weather. You didn't admire them so much as account for them. She had $4.20. She had a traveling bag gone soft at the corners from years of use. She had a clean apron folded at the bottom of the bag, a small tin of cure salts, and dried herbs her father had mixed according to ratios he'd spent 40 years perfecting, and a thin notebook with a cracked cover that held those same ratios in his handwriting, the ink gone from black to a faded blue-gray that looked in certain lights like the color of a cold morning sky. Her father had been a smokehouse man out of western Pennsylvania in the hill country, where the hardwood grew dense enough that you could have your pick of hickory or oak or applewood depending on what you were curing and what you wanted it to taste like in February, when the snow was 4 feet deep and there was nothing left of summer except what you'd put up against exactly this moment. He had learned from his father, who had learned from his. The knowledge passed the way useful things pass in families that don't have money, not through documents or institutions, but through proximity, through standing in a specific kind of heat and paying attention to what the smoke was telling you. He died in 1879, not dramatically. A winter that ran long a heart that had been working hard for 56 years, and one morning it simply stopped working. He left Mabel the notebook, the tin of salts, and the knowledge that those two things together were worth more than any deed of property or letter of reference, provided you could get someone to let you prove it. Getting someone to let her prove it had been the ongoing difficulty. She had worked in 3 states since Pennsylvania. She did not linger on the details of each departure, but the shape of the pattern was legible. She arrived, she demonstrated what she knew. And then the question of whether a woman alone in her mid-20s ought to be trusted with that kind of responsibility asserted itself in the minds of the men who wrote the checks, and she moved on before the question could fully form into something she'd have to refuse out loud. She was not a woman who wasted energy on situations that had already made their conclusions visible. She was 26 years old, standing in Copper Line with the dust of a lumber wagon on her coat and less than $5 in her possession, and she was not panicking. She had made an internal list of what she needed in the next 7 days' work wages sufficient to cover room and board in a place where the work was the kind she actually knew how to do. And she went about finding those things the way she went about everything, in order without announcement, starting with the most obvious source of information available. The notice board outside Goss's general store held a dozen slips of paper. Most of them were the usual notices: livestock for sale, a mare gone missing, a family seeking a laundress. Near the bottom, tacked slightly crooked, was a piece of brown paper with writing on it that was efficient rather than elegant. The hand of a man who wrote only when writing was necessary and stopped exactly when it stopped being necessary. Smokehouse work. Hard. Low wages. Inquire at Duskfall Ranch, Aldane Road, 3 miles west. No experience necessary. She read it twice. The last line gave her a particular feeling, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, somewhere between the two. No experience necessary. She put the slip in her coat pocket, turned to the nearest person who looked like they knew where roads went, and asked for directions. The ranch road wound through scrub pine and descended into a broad flat where the grass had gone gray gold with autumn, and the creek that gave the valley its name ran fast and cold between cut banks. The main buildings of Duskfall Ranch appeared before the road. Did she heard them first, the way you hear a working place before you see it? The specific sounds of animals and iron and men making practical decisions about how to get through a day. The ranch had the look of somewhere that had once been more prosperous than it currently was, without having entirely given up on the idea of being prosperous again. The house was 2 stories and solid, built from timber cut on the property, but the paint on the trim had gone to chalking, and one of the porch boards had been replaced recently with wood that was a shade lighter than everything around it, not yet weathered into the same gray. The bunkhouse behind it was in better repair. The bunkhouse always was. She had noticed on ranches where the work was ongoing even when the money wasn't. Men slept better in a tight building. They did worse work when they didn't sleep. The smokehouse sat at the south end of the yard near the tree line, and she saw it before she saw the office. She stopped walking for a moment and looked at it. It was small and dark boarded, and the grass around it had grown up untended on all sides. The vent pipe at the peak had a cap on it that had gone crooked, not broken, just neglected, the kind of thing that took 30 seconds to fix if anyone had been paying attention. The door had a visible warp along one edge, but the structure itself was sound. She could see that from 20 feet away, the way the foundation logs sat level, the way the walls hadn't shifted on their uprights. It was not a broken building. It was a forgotten one. Those were different problems with different solutions. She went to the office. The office was small, in the way rooms are small when they are built for function rather than comfort, and cold in the way rooms are cold when no one has tended the fire in several hours. She noticed the dead stove immediately. She noticed most things. The man behind the desk was broad across the shoulders and looked to be somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of face that a certain amount of difficult weather had made more legible rather than less. He didn't stand when she entered. He looked at her the way she had been looked at before in rooms like this one, a brief, practiced assessment, not hostile. Exactly, just professional in a way that was also slightly dismissive, the look of a man filing information into a category before you finish speaking. He began to explain the position. The smokehouse had been idle since the previous spring. He needed provisions cured before the snow came, ham sides of salt pork, the kind of winter stores that the difference between having and not having measured out in whether the men working his land stayed healthy through February. The work was physical. The hours were long. The conditions in the smokehouse were not, "I'll run it my way." The words came out of her clearly and without preamble, which was not the same as rudely. She simply said what was true and necessary. I choose the wood, I manage the fire, I control the cure from start to finish. Nobody questions my method. Nobody comes in and out of that building without a practical reason. I'll work as long and as hard as you need me to, and I won't fail you." She held his gaze without aggression, just steadiness. "But I do it my way, or I don't do it." The room had a quality of silence that happened after speech that was not expected. Corbett Aldane looked at her for a long moment, not the brief professional assessment of before, but the longer look of a man recalibrating. He reached into the desk drawer. He set the iron key on its leather cord on the surface of the desk and pushed it across to her without a word. She picked it up. The leather was cold. Outside the window of the ranch office, pressed against the wall in the particular attitude of a man who has accidentally become a witness to something and has decided that leaving now would only make it worse, Ruth Banning heard all of it. Ruth was 41 and had worked Duskfall Ranch for 6 years, which was longer than anyone else currently on the payroll, a fact he was aware of and occasionally leaned on. He was not a bad man. He was the kind of man who formed opinions quickly and defended them with more persistence than they sometimes deserved. He heard the woman's voice cut across Corbett's mid-sentence clean, no apology in it, no performance either, just the sound of someone who had decided what they needed before they walked through the door. He heard the silence after. He heard the small scrape of a key being pushed across wood. He stood there for a moment after her footsteps moved away from the office and toward the south end of the yard. Then he went to find Hadley Pierce. Hadley was 24 and had been on the property for 3 weeks, hired for the seasonal work of getting the herd sorted before winter and staying because the bunkhouse was warmer than it had any right to be, and the cook, despite everything, still managed biscuits on Sunday mornings. He listened to Ruth's account of the office scene without much visible reaction. She just told him how it was going to go. Hadley's voice had the careful neutrality of someone deciding how much to show. Before he finished his second sentence, Ruth had the air of a man who had witnessed something that unsettled his understanding of how things worked and wasn't entirely pleased about it. The smokehouse key was cold in her palm when she stood before the door. She did not use it immediately. She stood for a moment with the particular attention of someone who knows that the first look at a space tells you everything it has been trying to hide through the slow process of being ignored. The hinges had rusted at the pins. The door had swollen and warped along its left edge, not from moisture getting in, but from the absence of heat getting out from 14 months of no one lighting a fire inside. The spider web at the upper corner of the frame was old enough to have gone from web to something more like lace made of dust, and it moved in the slight draft that came across the yard without quite falling apart. She turned the key. The lock gave with a sound like something that had been held closed for too long. Inside, dark, close, cold, in the specific way that abandoned things are cold, not merely without heat, but emptied of it, as if warmth itself had given up waiting to be invited back. The fire pit at the center was deep gray with old ash. The hanging hooks above were bare and angled wrong. Someone had rehung them carelessly after taking down the last batch of whatever had been cured here. Last, someone who either didn't know or didn't care that the angle mattered, that weight distributed incorrectly across a hook could damage the muscle structure of the meat as it dried and ruin a month's worth of work. Along the back wall, a few planks remained with the salt crust of a previous effort, but the smell that clung to the walls was thin and stale. Whatever had been cured here before, it had not been done well. She stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, taking its measure the way her father had taught her to take the measure of any new workspace, not with impatience, not looking for problems to be discouraged by, but with the calm authority of someone who already knows what the place can become and is simply confirming that the path from here to there exists. In the corner, half buried under old burlap, she found a length of split oak. She picked it up, looked at it, held it near the dim light from the open door. Oak would run too hot and too fast for what she was doing. It would scorch the exterior of the meat before the interior had time to cure properly. She set it aside, not as waste, but as kindling. It would be useful for the initial build of heat before she switched to the hickory she'd asked for. Nothing was useless. Things were only in the wrong place. She asked for 3 things from the ranch store's coarse salt in quantity, not the fine ground variety that drew moisture too fast and collapsed the surface of the meat before the cure had penetrated green hickory from the stand along the east fork of the creek, where it grew dense enough to stay moist through October in time. No other requests. No assistant, no better tools, no apology for the condition of the building she'd been handed. The tools she had were adequate. The building was structurally sound. The rest was knowledge, and she had that without needing to ask anyone for it. The first 2 days she spent cleaning. Not scrubbing, that wasn't the point. She cleared the old ash from the pit, checking the depth and the condition of the stone lining, finding one cracked stone on the northeast side that she noted and worked around for now. She rehung every hook at the correct angle, each one tested by hand, before she moved to the next. She swept the floor of the smokehouse, not because cleanliness was ceremonial, but because the arrangement of the space mattered, because a smokehouse where you couldn't move freely was a smokehouse where you made mistakes at 2 a.m, when you were tired and the fire needed tending. On the third day, she built her first fire. She used the oak for the initial heat, feeding it slowly until the temperature of the building itself began to rise, and the walls, cold for so long they had become part of the cold, started to remember what warmth felt like. Then she switched to the hickory, green wood as she'd specified, because green wood didn't burn hot and fast. It smoldered. It produced smoke that was cool and dense and could be sustained over hours, over days, over the slow, deep time that proper curing required. Pale yellow smoke meant the wood was too cool and the cure would be incomplete. Dark gray smoke meant the wood was running too hot and she'd scorch what she was trying to preserve. What she wanted was smoke that was nearly white, thin, steady, rising without urgency, like breath on a January morning. She watched the smoke until she was satisfied. Then she went back to the ranch stores and began preparing the first batch. The opinions formed quickly among the men of Dusk Fall Ranch. This was not a surprise. 4 men who had spent 2 hard seasons holding a failing operation together on stubbornness and the specific loyalty that grows between people who have been through difficult weather without leaving those men were not going to receive a young woman in a worn coat with unqualified openness. They formed their views with the efficiency of people who were busy and believed they had enough information. Rufe's view was the loudest and therefore the most socially dominant, in the way that loud views tend to be in small groups with limited space for disagreement. He did not say anything openly hostile. He was too experienced for that. He said things that could be interpreted as observation. Practical concerns about timelines, questions about capacity, the kind of language that presents skepticism as merely being sensible. Hadley Pierce watched and said nothing. He had the habit useful in small spaces of waiting until he understood a situation before deciding how he felt about it. He went about his work. He watched the light in the smokehouse window each evening when he crossed the yard to the bunkhouse, a thin amber thread under the door that was there when he went to sleep and still there or there again when he rose before dawn for morning rounds. He noted this. He did not say anything about it yet. The morning of the second Tuesday, Rufe's patience for indirect observation reached its limit. He was near the water trough when Mabel crossed the yard with both hands occupied, her right carrying the water bucket, her left holding a length of hickory bark she'd been testing for something Rufe didn't know enough about to name. The way she moved had a quality of attention that was easy to underestimate as mere busyness. She was watching the smoke coming from the vent pipe at the peak of the smokehouse. She was reading something in it. Rufe said what he said, loud enough that the wind would carry it, quiet enough that he could claim. Later, he hadn't meant for it to carry. Something about smoke and daydreams. Something about whether anyone would be eating something other than dried beans and optimism by Christmas. He had a facility for this kind of remark. It wore the shape of humor, so the speaker couldn't be formally accused of cruelty, but everyone in earshot understood exactly what was being said underneath it. She stopped walking. Not because she startled, she clearly heard him and had already decided what to do before her feet completed the motion of stopping. She turned. She looked at Rufe Banning with no heat in her face and no performance of offense. Just the direct, unhurried look of someone deciding exactly how much of their energy a moment deserves. Friday of this week. Her voice had the quality of something being read from a ledger, precise, without inflection, each item placed deliberately. 1 full side of smoked pork, properly dried and salted, ready to hang in the cold store. A second side going into brine tonight, out and hung by the following Wednesday. Smokehouse temperature is stable. When the first side is ready, the color of the rind should be a deep reddish-brown close to mahogany. She held his gaze for one more beat.
If it isn't that color, you don't need to pay me for the week.
She turned back to the smokehouse and pulled the door shut behind her. She didn't wait to see his face. The man watching from the doorway of the bunkhouse, Hadley Pierce, who had been about to head out to the eastern fence line, saw Rufe's face instead. It was the face of a man recalibrating, which was not a comfortable face to be wearing at 8 a.m. with 3 other people watching. Nobody said anything. Rufe turned back to what he had been doing. Hadley went to the fence. Corbett rode past the smokehouse that afternoon on his way back from the south pasture. The official purpose was to check on the vent pipe. Smokehouse fires sometimes ran poorly in the afternoon when the wind came from certain directions and the draw was inconsistent, and that was a legitimate concern for a man responsible for a property and a season's worth of provisions. He believed this reasoning as he thought it. He believed it less clearly on the second pass, coming back from the eastern fence line by way of a route that added perhaps a quarter-mile to his return. He could hear the fire from outside. Not the fire itself, the specific quality of warmth it produced, the way the air immediately around the building had a different density than the air 5 feet away. He had spent enough time in cold places to feel the difference. He held his horse still for a moment and listened. There was the low, settled sound of wood doing what wood does at the right temperature. There was no sound of anything going wrong, no sharp crack of too hot wood, no thin smell that would indicate insufficient draw. Everything from the outside suggested that whoever was managing this fire knew exactly what they were managing. He turned his horse back toward the barn without dismounting. Behind him, the thin thread of white smoke from the vent pipe rose straight and steady into the cold October sky. That evening, the light in the smokehouse was still burning when Corbett stood on the porch of the main house with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He watched the thin amber line at the base of the door. He thought about the woman who had come into his office 4 days ago and told him in 20 seconds how the next 6 weeks of his operation were going to function, without asking his permission and without apologizing for failing to ask. He thought about the key he had pushed across the desk. He had done it before he'd made a conscious decision to do it. His hand had gone to the drawer, found the key, placed it on the desk and pushed it across with a motion so practiced it might have been planned. Except that nothing about the situation had been planned. She had simply made it clear what the shape of the agreement needed to be, and his hands had responded to that clarity before his mind had finished catching up. He had not thought of himself in the hours since as a man who had made a mistake. That was the thing that saddened him strangely. He had handed the keys of the only building on this property that currently mattered to a woman he had never seen before that afternoon on the basis of nothing except the particular quality of the silence after she'd spoken. And he did not feel he had made a mistake. He felt something more complicated, the feeling of a man who has done a sensible thing for reasons he isn't entirely sure were sensible. He went inside. The porch board shifted under his weight, and the night settled cold and dark over Sulphur Creek Valley, and the light in the smokehouse window stayed on. The days that followed had the quality of autumn finding its seriousness. The mornings came with frost on the grass that lasted longer each day before the sun burned it off. The Anaconda Range to the west caught its first snow on the high peaks, just a dusting barely visible from the valley floor, but visible enough to remind everyone who saw it that October in Montana was not a practice run. It was the real thing beginning. In the smokehouse, the work continued without pause or announcement. The men of Duskfall Ranch did not see most of it. What they saw was the outside of the building, the light in the window, at the hours when buildings that weren't being tended had no business having lights in them. The specific smell that came from the vent pipe in the mornings when the wind came from the south, the occasional request delivered directly and without preamble. Never as a question for supplies from the ranch stores. More coarse salt. Another load of green hickory, burlap in specific lengths. On Friday, the side of smoked pork was ready. Roof. Banning saw it first, or rather smelled it first, the specific sharp, sweet quality that proper hickory smoke gives to properly cured pork. The smell that reaches the back of the throat before the nose quite registers it as a smell, rather than simply a change in the air. He was crossing the yard when it hit him. He stopped walking. He stood with his head slightly raised, the posture of a man doing something he would deny doing if asked. He went to the cold store. The side of pork was hanging there exactly where she had said it would be, in exactly the condition she had described. The color of the rind, deep reddish-brown, close to mahogany, the surface dried to the tight and slightly glossy finish that indicated the cure had taken properly from the exterior all the way through. He did not say anything to anyone about this. He went back to his work. But Hadley Pierce, who had been near the cold store on his own errand and had seen Rufe's face in the moment of discovery, noted the expression and filed it away. Corbett was in the east field when the light changed that evening, the particular light of late October when the sun drops behind the western range and the valley goes from amber to blue-gray in the space of about 20 minutes. He turned his horse toward the ranch yard and rode the 3 miles back at an easy pace, following the line of the creek until the buildings came into view. He could smell the smokehouse from the gate. Not just the smoke, the specific combination of wood and salt and thyme doing its work, the smell that had no function as a smell except to tell the people who encountered it that something had been done correctly. He had not smelled that particular combination from this property in over a year. He had forgotten without realizing he had forgotten that he had known what it smelled like. He rode his horse to the barn, saw to it, and then stood in the cold evening air of the yard for a moment. The smokehouse door was closed. The vent pipe was trailing its thin white thread into a sky that had gone dark enough to make the thread invisible against the clouds. The light was on. He was aware of an urge to go and look inside the building that he did not immediately act on because he couldn't entirely separate legitimate concern for the operation from something else that was also present and less easy to account for. He was the kind of man who mistrusted urges he couldn't explain in practical terms. He filed the observation away. He went inside for supper. The next morning he rode past the smokehouse twice. On the second pass he noticed that the vent cap, the one that had been sitting crooked since the previous spring, the one that he had told himself he'd fix, and then never fixed, had been straightened. Sometime in the last week when he hadn't been watching, she had climbed up there and fixed the thing herself. He sat on his horse in the cold morning air and looked at the vent cap sitting properly aligned on the peak of the roof doing the job it was supposed to do. Then he rode on. There was a quality in the air of the valley that had changed in the past 10 days, and it was not entirely attributable to the season. The ranch still had all the problems it had before she arrived: the debt from 2 bad years, the equipment that needed replacing, the uncertainty about whether the spring would bring enough work to keep the crew together. None of that had changed, but the smokehouse was running. The smell of hickory and salt and thyme doing its proper work came across the yard every morning when the wind was right. The cold store had provisions in it that it had not had 2 weeks ago, and would have more. The winter that had been a formless threat had begun to acquire the shape of something that could be survived. He understood with the clear-headedness that cold air and physical work tended to produce in him that this was not a small thing. It was in fact the hinge on which the rest of the year turned. He had handed a cold key to a dead building to a woman he had never met, and she had turned it into something the whole property was going to depend on through February. He had not asked her name. The realization arrived the way realizations arrive when you have been avoiding them without knowing you were avoiding them all at once, complete with no gentleness. He knew the names of the 4 horses in the south paddock. He knew the name of the dog that the previous cook had brought with her and left behind when she left. He had spoken about this woman to Roof, to the supply driver, to himself in the long internal conversation that running a ranch required, and he had not once used her name because he did not have it, because he had handed her a key and pointed her toward a building and walked away. The smokehouse stood 30 yards from where he was standing. The light was on. The smoke was rising white and even. He stood still in the cold morning yard with the iron key in his coat pocket and his hat in his hand. Not metaphorically. Actually, he had taken it off when he left the barn and had been holding it by the brim ever since, the way a man holds something he doesn't know what to do with when he needs his hands to appear harmless. He was going to go in there and say something. He had not found the right words yet. He was not certain such words existed in the vocabulary of a man who had spent 35 years treating silence as a form of competence. But the sky to the north was the particular iron and violet of a valley that had maybe 2 weeks before the first serious snow, and the season would not wait for him to get it right. He took a step toward the smokehouse, then another. The cold air tasted of hickory and salt. The smoke rose thin and white and steady like breath on a morning that was only going to get colder. The rain came from the north on a Tuesday and did not introduce itself before arriving. 1 hour the sky was the usual flat gray of late October in Montana Territory, the kind of gray that had become so familiar it stopped reading as a color and started reading as simply the absence of anything better. The next hour the rain was there, cold, straight, and committed, the kind that settles into a valley the way a long-term tenant settles into a room, rearranging things to suit itself without asking permission. The men of Duskfall Ranch pulled their work inward. Roof spent the morning in the barn working a cracked harness collar with an awl and a length of waxed thread, his movements economical in the way they got when he was thinking about something else. The 2 younger hands found reasons to linger near the bunkhouse stove. Hadley Pierce went out in it anyway because the east fence had 3 weak posts he'd been meaning to reset before the ground froze solid, and postponing the work now meant doing it in conditions that were actively worse. He came back at noon with mud to the knee and the expression of a man who had been right about something that didn't make him feel any better. The smokehouse fire burned through all of it without interruption. This required a specific kind of attention that most people could not have named as a skill because it didn't look like one. It looked like sitting. It looked like waiting. From outside in the rain, watching the thin thread of white smoke from the vent pipe, you might have thought that very little was happening inside that building. You would have been wrong in the way people are wrong when they confuse the absence of visible motion with the absence of work. Mabel fed the fire at intervals her father had taught her before she was old enough to do it herself. intervals that weren't fixed to the clock but to the fire, to what the smoke was telling her about what the wood was doing. She read smoke the way careful people read letters, watching for the shift from white to cream that meant the temperature was climbing toward the wrong threshold, the shift to the faintest gray that meant the wood was giving out and needed feeding. She did not rush. She did not guess. Between the intervals, she worked on the second batch, checking the brine, pressing her fingers into the surface of the meat to feel what the salt had reached and what it hadn't yet, turning each piece with the systematic patience of someone who knows that the difference between done correctly and done almost correctly becomes most visible at the worst possible moment, which is always February. On Tuesday afternoon, Corbett rode past. He did not dismount. He held his horse at a walk along the south side of the yard, and through the rain, his gaze moved to the vent pipe, which was doing exactly what a properly tended vent pipe does in wet weather, drawing cleanly without the sluggish pull that indicated a fire struggling against insufficient oxygen. He registered this without stopping. He rode on. Wednesday he rode past 3 times. The third time was not on any route that connected 2 places he needed to be. Thursday morning, the rain was still coming down with the same flat persistence, and Corbett had been in his office for 2 hours attempting to work on the ranch ledger with the specific failure of a man whose attention has decided to be somewhere else. The numbers on the page were the same numbers they had been for 6 months. The slow grinding arithmetic of a property that had spent 2 years losing more than it made. He understood the numbers. He had understood them for a long time. What he was doing now was not understanding them so much as staring at them while thinking about something that had nothing to do with them. He closed the ledger. He put on his coat. He went outside. The yard was empty in the rain the way working yards go empty when the weather is serious enough that only necessary things happen. His boots hit the mud with the soft sound that mud makes when it has absorbed all the water it can hold and has simply resigned itself to accepting more. He crossed the yard toward the smokehouse. He told himself he was checking the draw. He was not telling himself an outright lie. The draw was a legitimate thing to check, but he was also not being entirely honest about the complete list of reasons for this particular walk in this particular direction at this particular hour. He reached the door. He raised his hand to knock on the frame. The door opened. She was standing in the opening with a cloth in her hands that she'd been using to wipe them, and the firelight from behind her turned the interior of the smokehouse into something warm and amber dark, the way certain paintings look in low light when you're seeing them for the first time, and they're better than you expected. She was not startled. Whether she'd heard his boots in the mud or felt the change in air pressure at the threshold, or simply possessed the quality of someone who was rarely surprised by the world's intrusions, she showed nothing that looked like surprise. She just looked at him with the steady, considering directness that he had noticed in the office, and was noticing again now the look of someone taking the measure of what was in front of them without any particular urgency to come to a conclusion. He said he'd come to check the draw on the vent pipe. Her response was measured, neither warm nor cold. The draw was fine, she said. She thanked him for coming to check. A pause developed between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the pause of 2 people who have each decided not to fill the space with something unnecessary. Outside, the rain kept its counsel against the roof. The fire behind her breathed in the low, settled rhythm of a fire that had been properly managed for many hours, and knew if a fire can be said to know anything, that it would be managed for many more. Then she said, without any particular weight on it if you wanted to plan around it, the first shoulder would be ready for testing in 2 more days. He said that was good to know. She nodded. Once took a small step backward, drew the door toward her. Not shut, just close enough that the warmth stayed in enough that the rain was redirected from the threshold. He stood for a moment on the other side of that almost closed door before he turned and walked back to the main house. He had heard her before the door opened. He had been standing with his hand raised, and the sound had come through the wood low, unhurried, entirely unself-conscious. Not a hymn, not a tune with a name he could locate. Something that belonged entirely to her, the kind of sound a person makes when they are alone and have forgotten briefly that being alone is a condition and not simply a state of nature. He had heard it for perhaps 4 seconds before the door opened, and he had not mentioned it, and neither had she, and yet it was the thing he thought about walking back through the rain rather than the vent pipe. 2 days later, she brought the first finished side of ham into the bunkhouse kitchen herself. She carried it balanced across both arms, the way a thing is carried when it has taken considerable effort to produce and deserves to arrive with a certain dignity. The kitchen was low-ceilinged. smelled of old coffee grounds and the particular staleness of a small room that had been warm for many months, and the four hands were at the table in the posture of men who had stopped talking about their hunger, because talking about it required energy they'd rather conserve. They looked up when she came in. The ham was dark on the outside, the deep reddish brown she had described to Ruth 8 days ago, close enough to mahogany that anyone who'd heard that description now understood she had not been speaking approximately. The skin was tight dry, carrying a smell that preceded her by 2 or 3 steps and arrived in the room before she did. The sharp, sweet quality of hickory smoke that had done its work over time rather than in a hurry. The deeper undertone of the cure of salt that had penetrated all the way through the architecture of the meat and changed what it was at the cellular level. She set it on the cutting board, stepped to the side, said nothing. Corbett had come in directly behind her, intending to say something practical. He had a sentence forming something about portions, about stretching what they had about the arithmetic of winter that he understood better than he wished. The sentence did not make it out of his chest. He stood near the doorway and watched. Ruth moved first. He picked up the knife from the table, not quickly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who isn't sure whether what he's looking at is real and is taking precautions against the embarrassment of being wrong, and cut the first slice. The knife went through the meat with the resistance that properly cured ham offers, the resistance of structure of something that had been changed into itself rather than simply preserved. He tasted it standing up. The silence that followed was the specific silence that arrives not from emptiness, but from something being too present for words. The way a room can go quiet when the thing everyone has been waiting for finally happens, and no one wants to be the first person to make the moment smaller by naming it. All 4 men were still for a breath. Then one of them, the hand called Ty, who had said almost nothing since Mabel arrived, made a low sound from somewhere deep in his chest. Involuntary, honest. Ruth reached for the knife again. Hadley Pierce leaned forward. The youngest hand, Clem, said something very quietly that sounded in both its rhythm and its sincerity like the beginning of a prayer, though he would have contested that description if anyone had pressed him. Mabel watched all of this from where she stood at the edge of the room. Her hands were folded. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the person behind them has been certain of the outcome and is watching others arrive at the same certainty on their own schedule. She was not performing modesty. She was simply letting the ham speak because the ham had done the work and deserved the credit. Corbett watched her watching them. It was in that moment, not before it, not in any of the moments that had been leading toward it, but in that specific moment of watching her watch 4 hungry men encounter something she had made, that it came to him. Clean and sudden, with no gentleness attached. He had hired this woman. He had handed her a key and pointed at a building and walked away. He had spoken about her, thought about her, registered the evidence of her work every morning when the smell came across the yard, and he had not once asked her name. Not once. He knew the names of the horses. He knew the name of the mule that had gone lame in September. He knew, for reasons he could no longer reconstruct, the name of the previous cook's dog. He had been on this property for 8 years, managing everything on it, responsible for every living creature on its land. And the woman who had just prevented his crew from spending February eating boot leather had been working in his smokehouse for 2 weeks without him knowing what to call her. The ham was being carved. The men were making the sounds of men who are eating something that reminded them why eating mattered. The kitchen filled with the warmth and the smell and the low, good noise of people being fed properly for the first time in longer than any of them wanted to calculate. Corbett stood by the doorway and carried the knowledge like a coal. He came to the smokehouse the next morning with his hat in his hands. Not as a figure of speech. Actually, in his hands held by the brim, his fingers working the felt in small, unconscious adjustments. He had taken it off before he reached the door because he needed something to do with his hands, and he had not trusted himself to knock correctly while wearing it. The smokehouse was warm, the second batch of hams hanging in their rows from the crossbeams, the air layered with hickory and the deeper, darker smell of cure that had been working for several days. Mabel was at the back wall with the brine, checking the concentration, with a practiced hand pressing her thumb into the liquid, feeling something in the resistance that translated for her into information. She did not look up when his shadow crossed the threshold. "I don't know your name." He said it plainly, the way a man says something when he has stopped trying to build up to it and has decided that the approach was the problem. The embarrassment was there in his voice, not hidden, not performed, just present the way an ill-fitting coat is present on a broad-shouldered man, visible and uncomfortable, chosen because the occasion required it. She looked up then. She held his gaze for a moment with that considering directness. Then she told him her name simply without addition and returned her attention to the brine. He did not leave. That was the part she had not anticipated. The calculation she had made without realizing she was making it had assumed he would receive the answer and go. The transaction completed, the small debt acknowledged and settled. She heard him take a step further into the smokehouse instead. She heard him clear his throat with the particular careful sound of a man who has more to say than he is sure how to say it. How do you know when the temperature is right? Not the question of a man filling silence. The question had weight behind it, the weight of someone who genuinely wanted to understand a thing and was willing to ask about it without pretending he already knew. She straightened. She looked at him again. Then she began to explain. She talked about the color of the smoke first. The pale yellow that meant too cool, the dark gray that meant too hot, the white that was almost but not quite the white of breath in cold air, thin and even rising without urgency. She talked about what the wood was doing underneath the smoke, how green hickory didn't combust cleanly but smoldered at the edge of combustion, how that edge was where the useful smoke lived. She talked about the weight of a ham at 3 days compared to 6, how you could feel the difference through the burlap, once you knew what you were feeling, for the slight decrease in the resilience of the surface, the way the muscle structure changed as the water left and the cure moved in to take its place. She talked about her father's ratio of salt to sugar in the cure mix. The sugar was not for sweetness, she explained, it was for chemistry. It drew moisture differently than salt alone, more gently, in a way that kept the outer layer from going hard before the interior had been fully reached. It was the difference between a ham that could survive February in a cold store and one that looked right but had gone wrong inside where you couldn't see it until you cut into it. She had not planned to say this much, but his questions were genuine, and she had no practice resisting genuine questions about work she cared about. She spoke the way she worked without looking for approval, without managing what impression she was making. Simply doing the thing that needed doing because it needed doing, and she was the one who knew how. He asked careful questions. She answered them. The autumn light moved slowly across the earthen floor of the smokehouse. Outside, the rain that had been falling for 4 days had finally stopped, and the sky that replaced it was the cold, clear blue of a Montana October that had remembered it was also November on the inside. Neither of them mentioned how long they had been standing there. Neither of them seemed inclined to resolve it. The story reached Copperline before it had finished happening, which was the particular speed at which stories moved in a valley with enough isolation to make other people's business feel like the necessary entertainment that it was. Emmett Goss heard a version of it from the supply driver on a Thursday morning, and the version he heard was accurate enough in its facts while managing to be slightly wrong in what it implied. A woman alone running the smokehouse at Duskfall Ranch, not working in it, running it, making decisions about wood and fire and salt without reference to any man on the property. The supply driver told it as a curiosity. Goss heard it as an opportunity. He was behind his counter when he said what he said, with 4 men present who represented the range of types that collected in a general store in the late morning, a rancher waiting for a part to come in on the wagon, 2 men from the lumber crew who came down from the hills every few weeks for supplies, 1 old man who had no particular business there but came anyway because Goss kept the stove hot. He had a loud voice that carried well in enclosed spaces, and the specific social confidence of a man who had never in his adult life said something in company that wasn't received the way he wanted it received. What he said had the shape of humor. It wore humor the way certain traps wear grass. The surface was light. The structure underneath was something else entirely. Something about smoke and skirts. Something about desperate measures at failing ranches. Something that located the strangeness of the situation in the fact of Mabel's presence rather than in anything she had or hadn't done. The 4 men in the store received it with varying degrees of comfort, which ranged from genuine amusement to the slightly stiff silence of a man who found something funny and would rather not examine why. Goss did not know as he said it that Hadley Pierce was standing in the supply aisle behind a shelf of rope and feed bags out of his sight line. Hadley had come in for a length of chain and a box of fence staples. He stood quietly where he was until Goss moved on to another subject, then paid for his items and left without speaking. He told Ruth that evening. Not elaborately, not with commentary. He said what he'd heard where he'd heard it and stopped. Ruth listened. He set down the harness he'd been mending. His face did the thing it did when he was recalibrating, a subtle tightening around the eyes, the look of a man revising an internal account. Who's telling the boss? Nobody answered. That meant everybody. Corbett was at the south fence line the next afternoon, a coil of wire in one hand when Hadley came out from the yard with the unhurried walk of a man carrying information he'd been holding for a day and had decided couldn't be held anymore. He told it the way he did most things, simply without embellishment, looking at the fence post rather than at Corbett while he spoke. Corbett listened until Hadley was finished. Then he set the wire coil down on the ground with the deliberate care of a man doing something slowly so that his hands stay occupied and his face has time to compose itself into something he is in charge of. He straightened. He looked at the fence post for a moment. The fence post offered no counsel. He did not go inside. He did not wait until morning. He walked the road into Copperline before the light shifted, which was a little under 3 miles, and he did it at a pace that was steady rather than hurried. The pace of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it rather than still deciding. Goss was still behind his counter when Corbett came through the door. The afternoon trade was thin, 2 customers, neither of them paying much attention to anything that wasn't their own business. Goss started to say something about the fence staples he'd been expecting Corbett to need, which was the kind of conversation he used to reestablish the ordinary register of interaction. Corbett did not sit down in the ordinary register. He stood at the counter and he said what he had come to say in a voice that was even and unhurried and left no seam a person could have inserted a response into without it being apparent that they were interrupting. He said that Mabel Forsyth was a hired hand at Dusk Fall Ranch who had been given a responsibility because she had earned it. He said he didn't find the situation amusing. He said he didn't intend to hear it made amusing again. Once. He said it once. Then he turned and went back out through the door. Goss did not speak for a moment after. The 2 customers near the back of the store became suddenly very interested in the items they were looking at. Outside, the sound of Corbett's boots on the porch planking went down the steps and into the street and then was gone. By supper time, the valley knew. Nobody could have identified the exact path by which it traveled, because that's not how news moves in a place where the social network is thin and everything touches everything else. It was simply known. The way weather coming in is known before it arrives, felt in the air, in the slight change in how certain conversations stopped and restarted, in the way the supply driver mentioned it to the man at the next ranch over, as though it were already established fact rather than fresh information. Mabel did not hear about it that evening. She came in late from the smokehouse the way she came in most evenings and took her plate from where it had been kept warm at the back of the stove without comment. The kitchen had the settled quality of a room where the main event of the evening had already happened, the conversations already run down to embers. The men were at the table in various postures of end-of-day ease. Hadley Pierce stood up when she came in. He had not done this before. There was no announcement, no ceremony. He simply rose from his chair with the particular deliberateness of a man doing something he has decided to do, and the motion was brief, and he sat back down without drawing further attention to it. Mabel noticed. She said nothing, asked for nothing, pulled her chair out and sat down and began to eat with the efficiency of a woman who has spent a long day on her feet and intends to eat properly before she goes to do it again tomorrow. The fire in the bunkhouse stove burned steadily. The room carried the smell of the ham that had been carved into over the previous 2 days, a smell that had sunk into the wood of the table and the walls and was not going to leave quickly. Something in the quality of the silence that surrounded the ordinary supper sounds had changed from the silence she had sat in 2 weeks ago on her first evening at this table. That silence had been the silence of people waiting to form their opinion. This silence was the silence of people who had formed it. The difference was not small. She left the smokehouse door unlatched one morning in the 3rd week and mentioned to Corbett when he passed on his way to the barn that he was welcome to look inside if he had a moment. She said it without ceremony, without any particular weight attached, the way you mention a thing that is available and leave the taking of it to the other person's judgment. He came an hour later. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping through the way a man stands when he is not entirely sure what he is about to feel and wants to give himself a moment before the feeling arrives. The interior was dim, warm, the fire held low in the way a fire is held when it needs to work quietly rather than hard. The air tasted of hickory and salt and something underneath both that had no single name. The smell of a winter that had been prepared for, which contains in it something that a winter that has not been prepared for, simply lacks the smell of actual safety rather than the hope of it. He walked the length of the building slowly. The shelves were not full. She would not have claimed otherwise, would not have arranged anything to make them appear more than they were. But they were serious. Wrapped hams from the crossbeams in orderly rows. Below them, the lower shelves held salt-cured sides packed in tight rows, each piece wrapped, each one labeled in her handwriting, neat, economical, the hand of a person who considered paper valuable enough not to waste. He reached out and touched one of the wrapped pieces on the lower shelf. The gesture was unconscious. His hand arrived there before his intention did the reaching of a man toward something he had stopped expecting to be able to touch. He held it for a beat, drew his hand back, looked at the shelf again, then he looked at her. She was watching from near the firebox with the careful inattention of someone pretending not to look at something they are very much looking at. Whatever moved across his face in that moment was not a thing he managed successfully. It simply moved across his face, visible for anyone paying attention. "There's more here than I expected." The words came out quiet, without decoration, carrying the specific weight of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. She held his gaze steadily, the way she held most things. "There will be more still," she said. He stayed in the smokehouse for another few minutes. He did not speak again. He walked back through the door and across the yard toward the house, and she watched the door. He had left open, the cold, clear air of late October coming through it and mixing with the warm, smoky air inside. And she thought about the notebook in her room and the ratios written in her father's fading ink, and she thought about the particular quality of the silence that had existed between herself and this man in this building just now, and she did not name what she thought. She went back to work instead. The fire needed feeding and the next batch needed turning, and there was still, as she had said, more to come. The cold that came in the final week of November was not the kind that apologized for itself. It was not the tentative cold of early autumn that arrived in the mornings and retreated by noon, the cold that functioned more as a reminder than a threat. This cold came in the night without announcement, settled over the valley like something that had been waiting for the right moment, and by morning it had made itself so thoroughly at home that the idea of its leaving seemed faintly absurd. Mabel had been watching the sky since late afternoon the day before. There was something in the quality of the stillness along the creek that ran behind the south pasture. The willows there had gone motionless, in a way that was different from ordinary stillness. The difference between a person standing still because they are resting and a person standing still because they are bracing. Her father had taught her to read that particular stillness when she was 9 years old, standing outside the smokehouse in Pennsylvania with her hands in her pockets while he pointed at a row of cottonwoods along the fence line. He had not used technical language. He had simply said, "When trees hold that still, they know something we don't yet." She had never forgotten the lesson. She had never needed to. The last curing batch needed 2 more days to finish properly. The temperature inside the smokehouse needed to hold through whatever was coming in from the north, and what was coming from the north had made its intentions legible to anyone who was paying the right kind of attention. She built the fire higher before midnight, not dramatically, not in a single move, but in the incremental, careful way her father had taught her, adding wood in amounts the fire could absorb without lurching upward into a temperature that would do more damage than the cold would. The night settled in around the building. She could hear the wind finding the gaps in the board siding, not getting through them, just mapping them, the way weather catalogs the weaknesses of structures it intends to test. The fire held. She fed it at the intervals the fire told her it needed, reading the sound and the smell and the color where the flame met the wood. She did not check the clock more than twice. The clock was not the relevant instrument. What she was doing in the hours between midnight and the gray opening of dawn was what she had always done in the hardest parts of the work. She was being present in the specific way that fire demands presence, the way that admits no distraction, no planning for tomorrow, no half attention. The fire was the only thing. The temperature was the only thing. The meat hanging in its rows in the warm dark was the only thing. Everything else could wait. Outside, the frost was doing what frost does when it is serious, not just touching the surface of things, but penetrating them, changing the cellular structure of the grass, turning the mud of the yard to something that would require a chisel by morning. The puddles near the water trough went solid. The vent pipe at the peak of the smokehouse breathed a thin stream of white into the darkness above, steady, uninterrupted, the one sign visible from outside that someone inside was refusing to let the night win. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the wall beside the firebox, her knees drawn up her coat across her shoulders, adding wood in measured intervals that she counted not by watching the clock, but by watching the fire itself. There was, in this kind of work, a rhythm that eventually absorbed the person doing it. Not meditative exactly, nothing so passive, but rhythmic in the way that walking a long distance becomes rhythmic. The body taking over from the conscious mind, certain decisions that the conscious mind is not fast enough to make well. Somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, she became aware of the specific silence that follows the worst of a cold front passing. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of something having been decided. The wind had dropped. The seams of the building were no longer being tested. Whatever the night had brought it, and now it was simply there, settled permanent in the way that November cold in Montana becomes permanent once it arrives. The fire was burning at exactly the temperature she needed. Every piece of meat on every shelf was exactly where she had placed it. Undisturbed, the cure proceeding on its schedule, indifferent to the drama of the weather outside because it had been protected from the weather outside. She did not make a speech about this to herself. She noted it the way she noted everything accurately without embellishment, and then she allowed her chin to drop to her folded arms and her eyes to close. Hadley Pierce came at first light because checking the cold store had become his habit in the third week without anyone asking him to make it one. He came across the yard in the gray early morning with his breath making small clouds in the air that was cold enough now to give breath visible shape, and he pushed the smokehouse door open with the usual motion. The door had a slight drag on it from the warped edge. You learned to compensate with your shoulder, and he stopped. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. His eyes moved across the shelves, taking inventory the way he'd been doing for weeks, finding everything in order, everything intact. His eyes moved to the firebox. The fire was still burning low and even doing its work. His eyes moved to the wall beside the firebox. She was asleep, sitting up. Her back against the rough board wall, her coat draped across her shoulders, her arms crossed over her knees with her chin resting on them. There was soot on her left sleeve from somewhere in the night. Her breathing was the slow, barely audible breathing of someone in real sleep, the sleep that comes after work that has been finished. Hadley looked at her for a moment. Then he turned around and went to get the others, not because the situation required them, but because some things should be witnessed. He said, "Only come out here." He did not explain. The quality of his voice apparently communicated enough. Roof came first, then Clem, then Ty. They crowded the doorway in the quiet way of men who understood without being told that quiet was what the moment required. They looked at the shelves. They looked at the fire. They looked at the woman asleep against the wall with her coat across her shoulders, and the evidence of an entire night's unassisted work visible in every corner of the building around her. Corbett arrived last. He had been in the barn when Hadley came for him. He crossed the yard with the purposeful walk of a man who has been told to come without being told why. And as he came through the doorway, the geometry of the smokehouse resolved itself for him, the way a landscape resolves itself when you crest a hill. All at once, everything in its place. The meaning of the composition arriving before any individual element of it. The shelves full, every provision intact, every batch completed or in progress on its proper schedule. The fire holding at exactly the right temperature, which meant it had been holding at exactly the right temperature through the worst frost in 6 weeks, which meant someone had been awake to keep it there. The woman asleep against the wall with brine on her cuffs from the hours before the frost came and soot on her sleeve from the hours after, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have pushed past exhaustion into the place where the body simply takes what it needs. Corbett removed his coat. He did this without speaking, without looking at the 4 men behind him. He crossed the earthen floor of the smokehouse with the kind of care that people use in places that require it, not tiptoeing, not performing silence, just being deliberate about where his boots fell. He draped the coat across her shoulders over the one she was already wearing, with a gentleness that was so matter-of-fact it was more affecting for what it didn't announce than for what it did. He turned to the 4 men in the doorway. His voice was low enough not to carry past the threshold. Nobody was to disturb her. Not a command, not a suggestion. The statement of a thing that had already been decided before the words arrived to describe it. Every man present understood without needing it explained that the question of what Mabel Forsythe was worth to Duskfall Ranch had just been answered once and completely in a room that smelled of hickory smoke and finished work. Corbett rode to Copperline 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon with the sky the color of pewter and the road frozen solid enough to ring under the horses' hooves. He had sent no word ahead. He went directly to the small office behind the church where Judge Warren Cull conducted his civic business, the legal functions of the territory that required someone with both the authority and the paperwork to make them official. Cull was 63 spare, with the economical manner of a man who had spent 4 decades presiding over the practical necessities of frontier life, and had learned to neither dramatize those necessities nor minimize them. He had a small cast-iron stove, a desk covered in documents, 2 chairs for visitors, and the kind of patient attention that people who deal professionally with other people's important moments learn to carry. Corbett sat in one of the chairs. He laid out what he wanted without preamble, the arrangement he was trying to accomplish, the name he wanted, added to the formal records of Duskfall Ranch, the legal instrument that would make the arrangement real rather than simply understood between two people. Cull listened. He had the stillness of a man who does not interrupt when the person speaking is saying something that requires the full sentence before a response is possible. When Corbett finished, Cull was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to have shape. Then he said what the law said. The territorial statutes of Montana, as they stood in 1883, did not provide a mechanism for a single woman to hold title to real property jointly with a man who was not her husband. This was not a matter of local preference or individual interpretation. It was written language in a document that predated Cull's presence in this territory by a decade, and his authority extended only so far as the law permitted it to extend. He said all of this with neither apology nor satisfaction. Just the plain accuracy of a man who understood that his job was to tell people what was true rather than what they wished were true. Corbett sat with this for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, a wagon went past on the frozen street. "Is there another way?" His voice had no pressure in it. It was a genuine question, the kind that opens rather than closes. Cull looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that takes the measure of what is actually being asked rather than simply what has been said. The office was very quiet. "There is," Cull said finally. "But that's a different question than the one you came in with." Corbett sat for another moment. Then he thanked Cull for his time, stood, replaced his hat, and went out into the cold street. He rode back to the ranch without stopping. The pewter sky pressed down over the valley. The mountains to the north were invisible behind clouds that had the specific heavy gray of weather with serious intentions. He did not go to the smokehouse that afternoon. He went to the main house. He sat at the desk where the ranch ledger lived, the ledger that had only one name on it, that had only ever had one name on it, that had been recording 2 seasons of hard mathematics under that single name, without ever reflecting the full truth of what kept the operation running. He opened it to the current page. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed it and went to bed and lay in the dark with the specific wakefulness of a man who has understood something he cannot ununderstand and has not yet decided what to do with the understanding. The snow came on a Tuesday. Not the preliminary snow, the exploratory variety that came in flurries and melted by afternoon. The real snow, the kind that arrived with the finality of a decision that has been made at a level above where arguments can reach it. By mid-morning, the valley had gone white in every direction, the kind of white that simplifies everything it covers, reducing the landscape to its essential shapes. The mountains to the north had disappeared entirely. The creek was still audible but no longer visible. The ranch buildings sat in the white like objects that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the snow to establish them properly. The crew stood on this bunkhouse porch and watched it come down. Roof had his coffee. Hadley stood with his arms crossed, looking at the sky with the expression of a man who has been bracing for something for weeks and is now experiencing the particular relief of finally dealing with the actual thing rather than the anticipation of it. Clem said something none of them heard clearly. Nobody asked him to repeat it. The smokehouse shelves were full. The fire inside was steady. The cold that was now burying the valley in white had already been accounted for, already been planned around, already been absorbed into the calculations of a woman who had understood what was coming before it arrived. Mabel knew the night before. She had spent the last of the afternoon checking every wrapping, every hook, every row of salt-cured provisions on the lower shelves, running her hands along the edges of each package with the attention of someone doing a final review of work they know is finished. When she was satisfied that everything that could be done had been done, she walked back across the yard to the main house, went to her room, and began in the lamplight to fold the contents of her traveling bag back into the order they had been in when she arrived. The tarpaulin apron clean, folded in thirds. The tin of cure salts, lid check set at the bottom. The notebook with her father's ratios, she held this one longer than the others, not reading it, just holding it the way you hold a thing that has been both tool and companion for long enough that the two categories have become difficult to separate. 6 weeks. The agreement she had made in Corbett Aldane's cold office on an afternoon in early October had been for work to be completed before the snow came, or the stores were sufficient, whichever arrived first. Both had now arrived essentially simultaneously, which she took as a form of precision she had not planned but could appreciate. She had done what she was hired to do. She had done it in full, without compromise, without requiring anyone to lower their expectations on her behalf. The terms of the arrangement made no provision for what came after. She had known that when she made them. She had left places before. The geography of her adult life was a series of departures, some of them clean, most of them carrying the slight ache of work left mid-investment of relationships that had been building towards something that the circumstances then prevented from becoming that something. She had learned across those departures to pack before the feeling arrived rather than after. Because packing after was harder and produced worse results, you forgot things, you lingered, you stood in doorways longer than was useful. She was packing. She was doing it correctly. The trouble was that the feeling had arrived before the packing was finished, which meant she was not operating on schedule. She set the notebook in the bag. She set the tin beside it. She sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight, with the tarpaulin apron across her knees, and looked at the wall which offered nothing useful in return. The smell of hickory smoke was in her coat, which was hanging on the hook by the door. It had been in everything she owned for 6 weeks. It would wash out. Smells washed out. She knew this from experience, from the accumulated evidence of every place she had worked, every building she had left behind. She told herself this was sentiment, which was something she had always been able to manage. She had always been the one who said when a thing was complete. She had always been the one who defined the terms of her own going. She did not finish packing that night. She went to bed instead and lay in the dark, listening to the snow that was coming, that was already there, pressing its silence against the window glass. The following evening, she went to the smokehouse for the last time. She had told herself it was habit, the final check, the thing her father had instilled before she had words for why it mattered. You looked at your work one more time before you left it, not to second-guess it, but to confirm it, to stand inside what you had made and know it completely before you handed it to the world. The fire was low-banked for the night by the hand that had tended it for 6 weeks. The shelves held everything she had built here, every hour of attention made tangible, every decision made correctly, now translated into provisions that would carry 4 men through February and beyond. The building smelled of itself, of the particular combination of wood and salt and time that she had spent 6 weeks building into these walls, these beams, this air. She touched the iron key at her collar. She had worn it there for 6 weeks on a strip of new leather she had asked for in the first week because the desk drawer was in the wrong building and the key needed to be where she was. It had gone from cold to warm in that time, the way objects do when they are carried close to the body long enough. It did not feel like borrowed property anymore. She heard his boots on the frozen path before she saw the light change at the door. She had heard those boots crossing that path enough times in 6 weeks to recognize the cadence without thinking about it, the particular weight of a tall man's step, the slight hesitation before the last stride that she had noticed but never named. She turned toward the door. He stood in the opening with snow on the shoulders of his coat, fresh enough that it hadn't yet melted into the wool. The cold air came in around him and met the warm air of the smokehouse at the threshold. His expression was the one she had not seen before, not the distance he had worn through October, not the careful calibration of a man managing how much he revealed. Something had been taken down. What was underneath was plainer, less protected, and had clearly cost him something to bring out here in the cold and stand in a doorway with. He had prepared words. She could tell by the way he stopped just inside the threshold and did not immediately speak, the pause of a man arriving at a destination, only to find that what he rehearsed in the abstract does not assemble correctly in the actual moment. She waited. She was not uncomfortable with the waiting. She had waited through 6 weeks of slow fires and longer silences, and the gradual, unannounced accumulation of something she was still being careful about naming. He called her ma'am. The word landed differently than it ever had before, not as courtesy, not as the automatic title that men in this territory attach to women they didn't know how to address. It had weight in it, the weight of a man trying. Then he said the rest. He had been thinking, he told her, since the first batch came out of the smokehouse. Since the evening the crew went silent around the table. Since the morning he found the drying schedule she had left under the door. The schedule written in her even hand that laid out in specific and intelligible detail every decision she had made about timing and temperature and the sequence of the work. A document he had read 3 times before he understood that what he was holding was the record of a competence he could not have replicated and had never in 6 weeks been adequately honest about. He had been thinking about the ledger, the ranch ledger that had 2 seasons of hard mathematics recorded under a single name. The ledger that did not reflect what was actually true about how Duskfall Ranch had survived into December, who had looked at the smokehouse first, who had known what the building needed before anyone else had thought to ask, who had been awake through the frost to make sure the last batch finished at the right temperature instead of the wrong one. He had gone to see Judge Cull. He said this plainly without building up to it as a fact she deserved to have. He had gone to ask how to put her name in the record alongside his. He said what Cull had told him. He said it accurately without softening it or putting a better shape on it than it had. Then he said Cull told him there was another way. The smokehouse was quiet around this. The fire spoke in its low, continuous voice. The shelves held their provisions in the dark. He had not come here to make a speech, he said. He had come because she was clearly preparing to leave, which was within her right, which was exactly what the terms of their arrangement entitled her to do. And because there were things that the terms of their arrangement had not covered that he should have said before now. The ledger should reflect what was true. What was true was that this ranch existed in December because of decisions she had made in October, and that a record that didn't reflect that was a record of something other than what had actually happened. He wanted her name beside his, not as an employee, not as a hired hand with a completed contract, as an equal line with equal weight in a document that was legally real and reflected the actual truth of the place. He extended his hand palm up, not as a demand, as an offering. The open-handed gesture of someone who is not certain they have the right to ask for what they are asking for, but is asking anyway, because not asking would be a more serious failure than asking and being refused. The smokehouse held them both in its warmth. Mabel looked at his open hand. She looked at his face. She had spent 6 weeks becoming accurate about this man. His silences, his careful questions, the way he had come to the smokehouse in the rain more times than the vent pipe required. She was accurate about him now. She knew the difference between a man who was offering something because it was convenient and a man who was offering something because it was true, and she knew which one was standing in front of her. She lifted her hand to the key at her collar. The leather cord had softened in 6 weeks of being worn. It slipped off without resistance. The key was warm in her palm, the warmth it had taken on from her body, the warmth it had carried away from every fire she had built in this building. She set it in his open hand. She closed his fingers around it with both of hers pressing them gently shut, the deliberate motion of someone completing a gesture rather than simply making one. Then she opened his hand again. She took the key back from the palm she had just closed. Not quickly, not as a withdrawal. With the slowness of someone accepting something that had been theirs all along, that had simply needed to pass through someone else's hands in order to be properly understood as theirs. "I'll stay." The words came out with the quiet certainty of something that had been true for a while before being spoken. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, because you've earned it." He did not say anything. He did not look like a man who had nothing to say. He looked like a man for whom what had just been said was sufficient, complete, requiring nothing added to it to make it more than it was. Outside, the snow came down over Sulphur Creek Valley with the indifference of natural things that have no stake in what happens beneath them. It covered the yard, the fence lines, the frozen creek, the road back to Copperline, the mountains that had vanished and were still there. It fell on the vent pipe at the peak of the smokehouse roof, which was still carrying its thin white thread of smoke upward into the white air, where the two whites became indistinguishable. By the spring of 1884, Judge Warren Cull had witnessed the signing of the document that recorded the full legal name of Mabel Forsyth Aldane as co-owner of Duskfall Ranch, Sulphur Creek Valley, Montana Territory, with all rights, responsibilities, and claims attendant to that ownership held in equal measure with Corbett James Aldane. The document was brief. The language was precise. Cull had written it himself because the standard form did not have a space that accommodated what the situation required, and he had found in the writing of it that he preferred his version to the standard form anyway. Rufe Banning did not make a speech about any of this. He was not a man who made speeches. What he did on the morning the document was signed, and Mabel rode back across the yard on the horse she had been using since February, was set down. The task he was doing, watch her dismount and say to no one in particular, and to everyone within earshot, "Told you she'd stay." Nobody pointed out that he had said no such thing. It was understood that some claims are best allowed to stand without examination. Hadley Pierce was the one who told it best years later to the people who asked about the ranch, and how it had come through the winters of 1883 and 1884 when so many others in the valley had not. He did not tell it as a story about luck or circumstance. He told it as a story about a smokehouse that had been left to rot and a woman who had looked at the ruin of it and seen without anyone's permission what it could become. He used a specific word every time when he described what Mabel did there. Not worked, not helped, ran. She ran that smokehouse. He said it with the plainness of someone describing a fact so settled that elaboration would only diminish it. Travelers who came through the valley in those years and stopped at Duskfall Ranch for a night, drawn in by the smell that reached the road before the buildings were visible. The specific combination of hickory smoke and salt that by 1884 had become the smell most associated with that stretch of the valley would sometimes ask about the woman they saw moving between the main house and the south building with the authority of someone who owned the ground she was walking on. Because she did. The answer they got depended on who they asked. But if they asked Corbett Aldane, he did not pause, did not search for the right phrasing, did not offer context or explanation. "That's my wife," he said. "She runs the smokehouse." Behind them, the building stood warm in whatever weather the valley was producing that day, full and fragrant smelling of hickory and the patience of careful work and the particular persistence of a woman who had known her own worth from the beginning. She had simply waited for the record to catch up with the truth.